Hi, everybody. I welcome you all to today's webinar organized by Ankara-based Center for Eurasian Studies, Avrasya İncelemeleri Merkezi in Turkish. And my name is Turgut Tuncel. Our webinar today is dedicated to the presentation, discussion of a recently published book on Turkish War of Independence or national struggle between 1919 and 1923. I want to share my screen with you, if you allow me. So this is the book that we will be discussing. So the title of the book is The Turkish War of Independence, A Military History, 1919-1923. It was published by Praeger Publishing last month in May 2021. Is there a problem with my voice?
Yes, there's static.
Yeah. All right. And the author of the book, who is also today's speaker, is Professor Edward Erickson. I believe most of you know Professor Erickson and also familiar with his academic studies. In fact, Professor Erickson has been the guest of 2 AVİM webinars this year. This is the 3rd time this year that we are having the honor of having Professor Erickson with us. Dr. Edward Erickson is a professor of international relations at Antalya Bilim University in Turkey and a retired professor of military history from the Department of War Studies at Marine Corps University in the US. He retired from the US Army as a lieutenant colonel with multiple combat tours in the field artillery and additional experiences as a foreign area officer specializing in Middle East. Dr. Erickson earned a PhD in history from the University of Leeds in the UK and is recognized as an authority on the First World War in the Middle East and Turkish military policy. Actually, naming Professor Erickson as an authority on Turkish military policy is no exaggeration. He's a prolific writer on Turkish military history who has published so many volumes, books, and articles on this topic. And these are some of his published books. And of course, I mean, he has a lot of articles as well, which I cannot show here. And actually, there is a problem with my voice, I think. I'm sorry. Can everybody unmute him or herself, please? Please unmute yourself. All right. So, if I'm not wrong, 8 of Professor Erickson's books have been translated to Turkish. So you can find those books in bookstores in Turkey. I'm saying this for the Turkish audience. Last but not the least, I should also proudly underline that Professor Erickson is a member of the advisory board of AVİM. So turning back to today's webinar, Professor Erickson's The Turkish War of Independence, A Military History, is the 3rd volume of the trilogy on the conventional wars of the Ottoman and Turkish armies in early 20th century. So these are the 3 books of the trilogy. The first one is Ordered to Die, A History of the Ottoman Army in the First World War. It was published in 2001. And the second one, Defeat in Detail, The Ottoman Army in the Balkans, 1912 and 1913. And this one, the recent book, is the 3rd one. And it's on Turkish War of Independence. So you may, our audience may also like to read the 2 previous volumes in order to have a holistic picture of the Ottoman and Turkish military policies in early 20th century. Of course, well, I mean, Professor Erickson's books, the recent book, is very important because until now, so many books on Turkish War of Independence has been published, but most of these books are focusing on a specific aspect or specific front of this warfare. But what makes special Professor Erickson's books is that it gives a really holistic picture of the Turkish War of Independence. It details Turkish Greek War, it details the Armenian insurgency, it details the insurgents pro-Istanbul insurgency, so on and so forth. So with this book, we really can have a very holistic picture of one of the most important episodes in Turkish history. So that's why actually we are very happy that this book was published. And actually, of course, different readers with different interests may find different points interesting in this book. So let me tell you, besides its holistic approach to the Turkish War of Independence, let me tell you what is most important for me in this book. So as an analyst, my areas of specialization are the Caucasus, Black Sea region, and Eastern Europe. And as you may know, hybrid warfare is one of the most topical and hotly debated concepts in the literature on these regions. And this is one of the reasons why I find Professor Erickson's book highly interesting, besides being a very important study on Turkish War of Independence. Professor Erickson conceptualizes the Turkish War of Independence as an early example of modern hybrid warfare, as a combination of different types of wars, like conventional, unconventional, counterinsurgency, and political, economic, and information warfare. Therefore, to me, this book does not only provide important insights on the Turkish War of Independence, but also on today's international politics in the vicinity of Turkey. Well, I think I have already extended my introduction too much. So now I want to give the floor to Professor Erickson. But before that, I would like to remind you that Professor Erickson's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining this event. And Professor Erickson, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I appreciate it very much. Ambassador Kılıç, Turgut, thank you for the generous invitation, and Oğuzhan, thank you for the support. Let's go to my first slide. So, a war made of wars, the Turkish War of Independence. Let's go to the next slide. So people ask me, what took you so long? I had intended to write this book 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago, but here's what happened. I was recalled to active duty, and I spent 2003 in Iraq with the U.S. Army. I then went back to Iraq in 2007, and then I was getting into the centenary of the First World War. So in an English language idiom, I got sidetracked. I went down a road, and it took me a long time to come back. So this took me 15 years to come back so I could finally write this book that I had been wanting to write for a long time. Why did it take me so long? That's the explanation. But a better question is what brought me back? What brought me back? Next slide.
Sorry. Yeah.
This is the guy that brought me back. This is my friend, Dr. Konstantinos Trevlos, who teaches at Ajigan University. He produced this book last year, Salvation and Catastrophe, on the Greek-Turkish War. And I had met him at a conference several times, and he contacted me and said, could you write a chapter on decisive battles? And getting back into the War of Independence through the idea of writing about the decisive battles of the campaigns really brought back my interest. So frankly, Konstantinos and my wife pushing me to restart this project got me going. This is a wonderful addition to the literature, Salvation and Catastrophe, and in addition to Konstantinos's chapters on strategy and the Greco part of this war, and Venizelos, I would point out that there's a young Turkish historian, Doruk Akyüz, who has written a good chapter in here on the legacy of the storm troops, the Hücum Tabur, which is a missing piece in our literature. So if you haven't seen this book, I hope you'll take a look for it. So thank you, Konstantinos, for bringing me back. Next slide. A lot of you know Jeremy. He lives in Turkey. His last book is about the human cost of the Ottoman wars. I like this quote: "Precise, detailed truth about the past is not attainable. The historian can only draw as close as possible to what he or she thinks is the truth. No wise historian would ever claim to the truth." What I'm going to present is not the truth. It is my interpretation of the events that I have studied for a number of years. So this is Ed's interpretation of what happened in this period, 1919 to 1923. Next slide. Don't you love this picture? He's passed now. He has died. Georg Eggers, taught in SUNY Buffalo. But I love this picture. This is history makes my head hurt. There can never be a total history. Every history can only present a partial reconstruction of the past. So I'm only looking at the parts after 100 years of what we can recover in the way of facts and analysis and data points. I don't have access to, no historian has access to everything that happened, in particular, why they made the decisions that they did. We know the decisions, we know the outcomes of decisions, but we don't know the precise reasons, all of the reasons why decisions were made. So I always point that out. And I also say this is a military history. This is not a social, a cultural, a history of politics. This is a narrow bandwidth of history that focuses on military campaigns. Next slide. Okay, this is a hybrid war. This is an American historian's appraisal. The Istiklal Harbi, the Milli Mujadele national struggle. I left out Kurtuluş Savaş, but this is a combination of wars. Today we call this hybrid wars. They are occurring simultaneously. These aren't sequential. They don't go from conventional war to irregular war to civil war. All of these are happening simultaneously. And Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, then Mustafa Kemal, has to deal with all of these going on simultaneously. My friend Konstantinos, who I just talked about, offered me this phrase, a war made of wars. I like this phrase a lot. The Turkish struggle for national liberation is truly a war made of wars. And we see all of these things going on simultaneously. Frankly, I don't honestly know how Mustafa Kemal put this all together in such a successful way, but I'll try to explain what I think he did, at least in framing a strategy to win the war militarily. Next slide. Yeah, this is in the West, in outside of Turkey, and maybe even in Turkey. This is our most common memory. It's the Greco-Turkish War. It is the occupation of Izmir and then the push into the center of Anatolia by the Greeks. And this is what most of the literature revolves around here in the West. And when I say the West, I mean Europe and the United States. It focuses, frankly, on victimhood. It focuses not on the military battles, but here in the West, it focuses on what happened to the poor victims of the war, both Armenians and Greeks mostly, and some on the Turks. But this is our memory is focused on this part of the war and excludes the rest. Next slide. Our memory focuses on Mustafa Kemal. He made the cover of Time magazine twice, once as the leader of the War of Independence, and then once as the president of his country when he died. But our literature also focuses on what he did in this war, both as a military leader, as a political leader of the Turkish nationalist movement. So when we think about the Turkish War of Independence, I'm going to call it the Turkish War of Independence because that's what most of the people here in the United States and Europe will call it. That's what they think about, the Greco-Turkish War and Mustafa Kemal. And when they're done thinking about that, they're finished. They don't know anything else really about this war and how unusual it was. Next slide. I think to fully understand the Turkish War of Independence, you might recall Germany's strategic dilemma. In World War I and in World War II, military historians believe that the two-front war doomed Germany to defeat. Germany had an enemy in the West and an enemy in the East. So it was very difficult for the German general staff, for the German commanders to apportion the strength. How much do I send where? And their solution in 1914 was to send almost all of the army against France in the Schlieffen Plan. It failed, and then they were stuck in a two-front war in the First World War. In the Second World War, after the Battle of Britain, and Hitler was unable to conquer Britain in the summer and fall of 1914. In the next year, in 1941, he launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union called Operation Barbarossa. And again, he failed. So here's the truth of it. The Germans never solved this strategic dilemma. This was a problem they could never get away from. Military historians regard this as a central tenet of faith, that if you have a two-front war, you've got an almost impossible strategic dilemma to deal with. So that I think is a prequel to understanding the Turkish War of Independence. Let's go to the next slide. Look at this. If you think a two-front war is a problem, if you think a two-front war is a dilemma, look at this. This is a 5 or 6 front war. You may hear a lawnmower in the background. My lawn crew has come to mow my lawn, and I hope it doesn't affect the sound. They'll be done in about 5 minutes, 10 minutes. But look at this. You have the Armenians in the east. You have the French in the south, with the Armenian Legion helping the French. You have Italians occupying Antalya. You got all these Greeks in the west. You've got the British and French in Istanbul. The French even control Zonguldak, where the coal mines are. And to make this even more complicated, you got these rebellions, these insurgents, these outbreaks of violence all through Anatolia. So this is a remarkable strategic situation for any commander, any general staff to deal with. This is the situation that faces Mustafa Kemal in 1919 when he gets off the boat in the Black Sea and goes down to Amasya and Sivas and Erzurum. So how do you deal with this? This is my research question is how does any commander, how does any general staff or polity facing this situation survive? Why weren't they crushed? Why did they survive? So next slide. here's what I think they did. In 1920, Mustafa Kemal and I will talk about Fevzi Çakmak as well, but they start to address these in a strategic way. The main effort, most of the nationalist army is focused on holding the Greeks and delaying the Greek advance from Izmir into the interior. While they're doing that, they allocate small forces around the borders and against the insurgents. Those are called economy of force missions. Economy of force means you're committing the bare minimum to that effort, so you can focus the bulk of the army somewhere else. So they launch an economy of force offensive to eliminate the Eastern Front, and they do. In 1920, they pound the Armenian army into submission and win a war against the Armenians. So 1920, that's what happens. Next slide. So here's the situation in 1921. They're still focused on holding the Greeks with Izmir and Anu and the bulk of the conventional army. At the same time, they then shift the effort, an economy of force effort, to the southern front against the French. And I'm going to talk about these in a little more detail later. I apologize for that. That's the lawnmower going past. It'll be over in just a few minutes. They eliminate the French on the southern front. Next slide, in 1921. In 1919 to 1921, at the same time they're addressing the Eastern Front and the Southern Front, they are applying minimal forces against the insurgents in the interior. That goes on a little bit longer than 1921, but it's pretty much over by 1921, early 1922. Next slide. So by the summer of 1921, they've pretty much resolved the strategic dilemma. And you'll notice that with those enemies on the south and the east gone, and the insurgencies suppressed in the interior, now they can then focus on the Greeks in the west, which have always been their main problem. So there is what I call a strategic pause. In the fall of 1921, after Sakarya, there's a strategic pause where Mustafa Kemal recognizes a culmination point and prepares for the strategic offensive. Next slide. After a period of intense training and rebuilding the nationalist army and restructuring, in the summer of 1922, in August, they go over to the offensive with a decisive effort that you know as the Büyük Taarruz, the Great Offensive. They go over to the strategic offensive. Next slide. It takes them 2 months, and they sign an armistice at Mudanya on 11 October 1922, and that's it. That's a beautiful strategic solution. They have solved the dilemma that the Germans could not. All right, next slide. So what was their strategy? I don't find this in any of the literature. I don't find this in any of the reading that I've done in Turkish or anything. So this is, maybe this isn't the truth, as Jeremy Salt had talked about, but this is my interpretation. What is their strategy? The ancient Romans, a guy named Quintus Fabius Maximus, after Cannae, developed what we now call a Fabian strategy. A Fabian strategy is a military strategy where pitched battles and frontal assaults are avoided in favor of wearing down an opponent through a war of attrition and indirection. time is on Mustafa Kemal's side. The longer Mustafa Kemal drags out the length of the war, the stronger he gets, the weaker the enemy gets. The most famous practitioners of a Fabian strategy in modern times, our own George Washington, who led the United States Army in our own revolution, Mao Zedong, the famous Chinese leader who led in a 20-year war, the Chinese Communist Red Army to victory over the Nationalists, and then famously a brilliant Vietnamese general named Vo Nguyen Giap, who used this against the French and then later against the United States. So in a nutshell, I think Mustafa Kemal and the Nationalists used a Fabian strategy. Next slide. It wasn't just Mustafa Kemal. He was, of course, the commander-in-chief. But he only has 24 hours in a day, and he's got to sleep and eat and have a cigarette here or there. So the man that helped him, Fevzi Çakmak, who he was alternately Minister of War and Chief of the General Staff. Much of the staff work in Ankara was done by Fevzi Çakmak, who was tasked to supervise the staff officers who put together plans and logistics and training programs and all of that stuff. So this is what we call a strategic partnership. There have been several famous strategic partnerships throughout military history. Hindenburg and Ludendorff in the First World War. In the Second World War, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Admiral Leahy, Churchill and his chief of staff. So this is a common part of military history. It's never just the commander. It is always a chief of staff backing him up who does the legwork or the staff work. So this strategic partnership, I think, owes a lot to Fevzi Çakmak, and I think he's underappreciated in the literature. Next slide. So let me talk about some of these fronts. The Armenian Front, the Eastern Front, was conventional war. This is regular army divisions conducting mobile warfare or a war of maneuver against the Armenians. And in a 2-month war, a very short war, Kazım Karabakar takes Kars and moves up. He takes Sarıkamış first, and then he moves up and he takes Kars, and he destroys the Armenian army in a very short war. This is not quite a blitzkrieg, but this is as close as you can get to a blitzkrieg in the mountains of Eastern Anatolia in 1920, before tanks and armored vehicles. This is a brilliant campaign, Kazım Karabakar's campaign. Next slide. In the south, the Franco Turkish War. There are some conventional forces down there, but this is a war that is largely conducted by very small parts of the nationalist regular army and a whole lot of nationalist militias who are good fighters and organized as irregular combatants. So the Southern War, the Southern Front, this truly is a hybrid war down here that combines elements of all of irregular and conventional war tactics. It lasts a bit longer. This is about a 2-year war. But the point of this is to exhaust the French and to wear out the French. And they finally decide that they can't afford this war anymore, and the French basically quit. They've got problems elsewhere. They've got problems in North Africa. They've got problems in Indochina. And France is almost bankrupt from the First World War. So this is very successful in exhausting. This is not a decisive military victory. This is a war of attrition and exhaustion that the nationalists win conclusively. Next slide. Here's a problem. You've got a number of these ethnic minorities who rise in rebellion. Not everybody in Anatolia wants to be a Turkish nationalist or a Kemalist. There are a number of small groups, tribal groups from the Caucasus, bandit groups, groups of Kurds who don't want to pay taxes. The largest and most dangerous of these groups are the Black Sea Greeks and the Pontos. That's the largest, up near Samsun on Amasya, Tozgat, Trabzon. That's a big problem. Next slide. The Turkish official military history, they have a whole book devoted to this problem called Uprisings During the Independence War. And there are 24 of these between 1919 and March of 1923. They categorize them, and I find this fascinating. There are isyan, or rebellions, ayaklama, or uprisings, olay, or incidents, and çarpışması, or clashes. So they organize them chronologically, but they also present them in terms of the degree of seriousness that they present to the nationalists. The Pontos is an isyan. That's an actual rebellion. Nurettin Sakala crushes it very brutally, unfortunately. This is a very draconian campaign, but I point him out because he was the man responsible for the campaign against Townsend at El Kut in 1915 that traps General Townsend's army in El Kut. He is relieved, of course, by Enver Pasha's brother-in-law, and he doesn't get credit for the victory. But this is a brilliant guy. This is we would call him in English a fighting general. This is a fighting general right here, Nurettin Sakala. And I think he's also, like Fevzi Çakmak, I think he's underappreciated in the existing Turkish literature. Next slide. Okay, the main front, First İnönü. Here's İzmit, who up until First İnönü, the largest organization he has commanded is an army corps. So his experience is at corps level and below. At First İnönü, he wins a decisive defensive victory at a small train station called İnönü. And you know that he will adopt that name as his family name after the name change law in Ataturk's Turkey. So this is his first experience. He's fighting at corps level. So I call this coming of age. Coming of age is an English expression that means you're coming out of childhood and learning to be an adult. And that's a metaphor for what's happening, not just to the nationalist army, but for commanders like İzmit İnönü. He's leaving the level of corps command and moving up to the level of army command. Next slide. Second İnönü closely follows. Again, he wins a defensive victory, but it's very difficult for him. So he's learning the ropes. Next slide. Eskişehir, or Kütahya Eskişehir in July of 1920. Look at this, January, March, July. He's fighting almost continuously in 1921. And he defeats the Greek army's offensive, which is designed to crush the nationalist army. At this point, he is now an army commander, a front commander. So he's moved up an echelon. It's the higher up you go in command, the harder the job is, because you have more forces and you're not personally observing on the battlefield, and you're not personally giving orders to subordinates. You're writing orders and sending them to subordinates. So he's moved up to Army Command, and he's successful. It's hard for him, and Mustafa Kemal has to come down and give him some advice, as does Fevzi Çakmak. But he makes it through this and stops the Greeks. Next slide. This is, I think, his greatest moment as a commander. İzmit at the battle. This is not a battle. This is a campaign. This is a 2-month-long campaign involving 4 phases. There's a Greek movement to contact, and then there's a Greek attack of the nationalist positions along the Gok River, and that fails. And then there's a nationalist counteroffensive and a nationalist pursuit. So this is a long and involved, it's very complex, this whole thing. We think of it as a battle. It's actually a 4-phase campaign, a series of battles is what it is. He is now an army or a front commander, and he does a really good job in reacting to the Greek attack, and then when the Greek attack fails, to launching a counterattack and a pursuit in August and September of 1921. Next slide. Why do I think Sakarya is so important? This is the point at which, after Sakarya, the Greeks cannot win. It's done. They're done. Greece starts looking for a way out of Asia. They recognize politically and militarily that they can't win. They have lost the initiative, and they have now changed their posture from an offensive to a defensive posture. Time has run out for the Greeks. Their army is demoralized. On the other side, on the nationalist side, morale and confidence in the nationalist army goes way up. So this is a shift. This is a actual culmination point. Some important outcomes of this. The Greek general Papalas, who has been commanding in what the Greeks call Asia Minor, he's a pretty good general. He understands the strength of the nationalist army. He understands the weaknesses of his own army. He's made some mistakes, but he's competent. This is a competent guy. They replace him with Georgios Chatsanestis, who is incompetent is a kind description for this guy. He is not a general who I don't think understands modern war in the same way that Papalas had understood modern war. So this is a bad mistake for the Greeks. Mustafa Kemal finalizes his command team. One of the outcomes of Sakarya is that Mustafa Kemal and Fevzi Çakmak and İzmit İnönü are pretty sure who the generals are who can successfully and ably command Army Corps. So the lineup of Army Corps, of the 6 organizations that will become the 6 Army Corps of the Nationalist Army, those commanders are decided upon after Sakarya. Sakarya is such a great victory that the nationalists can now enter a strategic pause. They have defeated the Greeks so badly that the nationalists can now take advantage of a time window that goes from November 1921 until the summer of 1922. There's no serious Greek threat at this time, so the nationalists can then embark on some other important endeavors. Next slide. Sakarya is a culmination point. A culmination point is a point at which the army can no longer conduct the operations it's been doing. Malcolm Gladwell calls this the tipping point. So Sakarya is the culmination point for the Greek army. It is a point at which they stop conducting offensive operations and they are now on the defensive. It is a strategic pause. this is not a prolonged war. Mao Zedong's prolonged war was a 20-year endeavor. But I'm going to explain this in terms of Mao Zedong's famous three-phase prolonged war. Mao Zedong talked about the three phases of his strategy to defeat the Chinese nationalists. In the first phase, it was entirely defensive, and Mao Zedong's objective in this phase was to survive, was to keep the army in being, to keep the army alive and well, and at the same time, attriting and weakening the enemy. So this is the same thing that George Washington did. This is the same thing that Nguyen Giap did in Vietnam against the French and the United States. And to do that as long as it takes until you recognize the culmination point, where you recognize the enemy is so weak they can no longer attack. Then there's a strategic pause, where you change the posture of an army. An army that is configured and fighting defensively is not trained or equipped to attack. They're not in an offensive posture. So to change from a defensive to an offensive posture, you have to prepare the army. You got to train and equip them. You got to support them logistically. You got to pick the right commanders. So this is a hard thing to do. This is a hard thing. Not everybody who tries to do this can do it successfully. Once you've done that, once you are entirely ready, then you launch the strategic offensive and you seek decisive battles, and your intent is to annihilate the enemy. This is what Giap did in Vietnam. It's what Mao Zedong did in China between 1946 and 1949. Next slide. All right. So what are the other pieces of the hybrid war construct, of the war made of wars? I'm going to talk about diplomacy, information. I've already talked about the military, and I'll talk about those types of other things that Mustafa Kemal and his associates are doing at the same time. On the diplomatic front, these are critical. They need weapons. They need money. The nationalists need artillery and aircraft. So they reached some agreements. They reached an agreement with the new Soviet Republic in March, called the Moscow Agreement, where the Soviets now ship military equipment and they loan money. They reached an agreement with the Soviets over Armenia in October, and with the French in Ankara in October as well, that this now ends the wars formally. Now the nationalists, those wars against the Armenians, against the French, are now conclusively over, and now they have diplomatic cover, if you will, to shift forces against the Greeks. So these are critical in guarding the back door, if you will, to Anatolia. The back door is now shut, and they can move everything to the front door to fight the Greeks. Next slide. The home front. This is a famous painting from the museum underneath Ataturk's mausoleum in Ankara. It is a signature of the Turkish narrative on the War of Independence, that the home front is mobilized. Women go to factories to produce munitions. Ox carts and donkey carts are used by women and children to bring the munitions forward to the combat troops. The old men come out of the tea houses, out of the chai bachis, and return to work to help the war effort. So this is an important part of the Turkish narrative. It's the total mobilization of the Anatolian population to help Mustafa Kemal. Is it true? Well, yeah, most of it is. Yeah, this is a remarkable event, and most of this narrative is actually true. I love this painting. Next slide. But you have to go back and say, okay, who did it? This didn't just happen spontaneously. There's an organizer, and in the same way that that Trotsky was the organizer of the Red Army in the same way that Lazare Carnot was the organizer of the French Republic's army in 1791? In my view, and I could be wrong, but I think Rafet Bili, who's the Minister of Defense, plays a large part in the mobilization of Anatolia in deciding what to do and who does what and where to move things and what roads to repair and what roads not to repair. This can't be done. What the Turks did can't be done without somebody guiding the plan. And I think that's Rafet Bili. This is integral. This is instrumental to winning this war. And it starts in November 1921. And it goes until 1922. This is the preparation phase. So while the army is training and re-equipping, behind the lines, the country, the nationalists are mobilizing. Next slide. On the informational front, up until late 1921, the British have been actively supporting the Greeks. Lloyd George has been pushing the cabinet for British support for the Greeks. Lloyd George is a Hellenophile. He would like to see a larger Greece. He would like to see a strong Greece. Well, some things happen that change that. The White Russians are defeated. The Bolsheviks win decisively and establish the Soviet Union. This creates a revival of the Western fears of the Russians. The British fear the Russian expansion and Soviet expansion into the Mediterranean. After the Greeks are defeated at Sakarya and the Greek government starts to come apart, starts to destabilize, the cabinet and the army general staff in Britain, who have been maintaining some communications with the nationalists and watching Mustafa Kemal, they recognize in the winter of 1921, that the Greeks, even if the Greeks win decisively, they would be too weak to stop the Soviets. So British policy reverses over the winter of 1921, 1922, and the British policy now favors Turkey. They prefer a strong, unified Turkey. They understand that the Turks can probably stop the Soviets, but the Greeks can't. So this is the informational front that I've talked about. Next slide. In July of 1922, the strategic pause has been completed. The army is ready. The country has mobilized and they're prepared to support the army. So in August, they plan to launch the Büyük Taarruz, the Great Offensive, which is a campaign of annihilation against the Greeks. Next slide. It looks something like this. And again, I think Fevzi Çakmak is underappreciated. Fevzi Çakmak, as early as November 1921, sends some draft plans down to İzmit İnönü, saying, "What do you think? This is a possible encirclement battle of annihilation." Fevzi's plans are similar to what we see here. It involves a dramatic encirclement of 2/3 of the Greek army, which is exposed in a vulnerable salient around Afyonkarahisar. And if he's not responsible totally for the plan, I attribute Fevzi Çakmak as starting the dialogue. He's the one, as near as I can tell, who starts the discussion with his İzmit İnönü and his army commanders about what will happen as a strategic offensive to crush the Greeks. Next slide. İzmit İnönü moves up to be an army group commander. The nationalists, in laying out their command arrangements, form two new armies. The first army, commanded by Nurettin Sakala, he of course came down from the Central Army in the east, and Yakup Şevki Şubası, who commands the new Second Army. So they have reorganized the front against the Greeks into two armies. So İsmet İnönü, who has been an army commander, now moves up an echelon to become an army group commander. Very, very, very interesting event, I think, for İsmet. The offensive is carefully planned. This is remarkably well planned, and it launches on the 26th of October, 1922. The main effort is in the south. The artillery, the heavy artillery, is concentrated in the First Army sector. That is the decisive part of the front, and it involves a breakthrough and a movement into the rear of the Greek army. At the same time that happens, there's a smaller supporting effort in the north with Jakub Szewski's Second Army. And that happens very quickly. The first day, on August 26th, they don't quite break through, but the second day they do. Next slide. Within several days, the Greeks are on the run. Mustafa Kemal himself comes forward. And this is the phase of the Great Offensive called the Commander-in-Chief's Battle, where they encircle basically 5 or 6 Greek divisions and 2 Army Corps headquarters inside a pocket. This is rare. This is what happened at Tannenberg in 1914. This is a rare event before World War II. Many countries plan encirclements from 1900 up until 1941, but very few countries actually can make it work. They make this work. This is a remarkable thing. They trap the Greeks and they force the 2 corps commanders to surrender. So this battle is pretty much over in 3 or 4 days, this campaign of annihilation. Next slide. This is a guy who I'm quite taken with, Fabian Altay. He's your cavalry commander, your new tank. The Altay tank is named after this guy. If you look at that red box, that's the 5th Cavalry Corps. Now that 5th Cavalry Corps today in the modern Turkish army is the 5th Corps out at Çorlu. But in these days, it's a cavalry corps, the 1st and 2nd Cavalry Divisions and the 14th Cavalry Divisions. This is a new thing. The Turks haven't had good cavalry for a long time. Fabian revives the Greek cavalry arm, and this is instrumental in moving quickly into the rear area. So I think he's also maybe not quite as underappreciated as some other generals, but this is a pretty capable. He's the Phil Sheridan. He's the Jeb Stuart. Those are cavalry commanders from my army who are world famous, and he's that guy for the Turks. The next slide. This results in a catastrophic defeat of the Greek army in Asia Minor. Kemal and İzmit launch a pursuit that by the 9th of September liberates Izmir. This is a very controversial liberation. As you know, the city catches on fire. And to this day, it is a controversial point as to who started the fire. Why was it started? Was it intentional destruction or not? And there's a vast literature in my country and in Western Europe on what actually happened in the liberation of Izmir. Next slide. This leads to the Mudanya Convention. At the end of the Great Offensive, the Greeks are expelled from Asia Minor. And this is a conclusive, decisive victory. Lloyd George and the British and the French finally cave in, and it's now a new government in Britain, and negotiations convene in Lausanne, Switzerland in November. They're very rocky. The Allies try to push the Turks into a compromised position, and they refuse. İzmit İnönü, in addition to being a great general, is a world-class negotiator. and he leaves the negotiations collapse for a month and a half. İzmit comes back to Lausanne, and he forces, based on Mustafa Kemal's instructions, he forces the Allies to pretty much give Turkey everything they want. So this is a remarkable diplomatic success. The negotiation of the Lausanne Treaty is remarkable under any circumstances. There are important bilaterals. Greece is not part of the Lausanne Treaty, but Greece, but İzmit and Venizelos coordinate bilateral treaties called Lausanne 5 and 6 that allow for legal population exchanges after the war is finished in January to May of 1923. This leads directly to the Republic of Turkey being proclaimed on October 29th. Next slide. So without the victory, without these guys, without Mustafa Kemal, without Fevzi Çakmak, without İsmet İnönü, without Kazım Karabekir, without Rafet Bili, without this world-class lineup of leaders, that's Sevres. That's what Turkey would look like had the Sevres Treaty of 1920 been enacted, that tan area. That would have been Turkey without the victory. Next slide. With Turkey, with Lausanne, this is Turkey. And they will, as most of you know, not control Hatay province initially, but in 1936 will recover Hatay province. So Lausanne defines success. We're looking at success here in a way that in 1919 nobody thought was possible. If you went back in 1919, the nationalists are a small player. The nationalists are bit players in a larger drama of international intrigue and occupation to take large parts of Anatolia. This is remarkable. Next slide. So I'm going to come to the end here. Why did the nationalists win? What are the major elements that take that multi-front, that 2, 3, 4, 5 front war, the war made of wars, and turn it into a success? The first thing I think is the strategy. Strategy is a careful balancing of ends, ways, and means. Ends are what you want to accomplish. Ways are how you mean to accomplish it. Means are the resources that you dedicate to accomplishing the mission. So the nationalists have the central position. They can hold in the east and hold in the west and then devise a strategy. So the strategy is to hold the Greeks in the west and deal with the Armenians from the center, and then deal with the French from the center. So Napoleon Bonaparte uses this phrase, the central position. It works if you can manage the strategy. So this is the national strategy that I've talked about did this. Mustafa Kemal, dime. Dime is a word that if you go to an American staff college, an American war college, you will hear as central to a national war effort. The integration of diplomacy, of informational war, of military means, and the economic means to win a war. So these are called domains, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic domains. Mustafa Kemal integrated these. He was able somehow, with that, his magnificent grasp of strategy and human affairs and the threats and how the economy might be leveraged to success. He was able to integrate these things all at the same time. This is enormously hard to do. The Germans couldn't do this in World War I or World War II. Senior nationalist leadership was battle-tested, trusted, and proficient in the art of war. The commanders of the nationalist armies from top to bottom, all of these guys have fought in World War I. Most of them have fought in the Balkan Wars, and they fought the British, and they fought the Russians. So these commanders, the corps commanders that in addition to Ferritin, Altai, and the division commanders, they are first. These are world-class commanders. The Greeks have nobody like they have one or two here and there, but the nationalist army is chock full. It's packed full of these really good commanders. Lastly, time and space. This goes back to time favors the nationalists. If the nationalists can drag out the war, if they can make their enemies weary or tired, all they have to do is wait long enough and hold off the enemy. And they can partially win this war. The United States is leaving Afghanistan this summer. We've spent 20 years in Afghanistan. Time in Afghanistan has always been on the side of the Taliban. It's never been favorable to the NATO mission in Afghanistan. Time and space. The Greeks have big plans, but the Greek army never tops out much more than 200,000 men. It's too small an army to operate in the vast space of central Anatolia. So the professionals call this troops to task. The number of troops that were available to the Greeks was never equal to the task of defeating the nationalist army. So this is critical. Time and space favor the nationalists. Now, this is why they won the war made of wars. Any one of these, if they had not done this successfully, probably would have resulted in a nationalist defeat. Well, next slide. So this is pretty much the end of my pitch to you. The Turkish War of Independence, it is a war made of wars. If you go back to 1919, a nationalist victory is unthinkable. It is simply not in the deck of cards that anybody thinks the nationalists can play. Nobody can imagine in 1919 that the outcome will be such a resounding success. So this is the story of this war. I've tried to put this together in a way that I understand. And let me wind this up with just one thought. I'm a historian. I'm a military historian, but I'm also a practitioner of the art of war. I was in the U.S. Army for 27 years. So part of my understanding of these events comes not simply from my training as a historian, but also as my long experience in an army, examining and practicing the art of war and the art of leadership. So I think in the production of this book, my experience as a soldier has equal value and equal weight in my interpretation of the event. So with that event, I've talked longer than I would have liked to. It's hard for me to compress my thoughts, but at this point, we could take questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Professor Erickson. This was a really wonderful and very comprehensive presentation. And actually, I would like to remind one more time about your trilogy for our audience who may like to have a holistic idea about Turkish wars in the beginning of 20th century. So these three books we highly recommend to our audience. All right, so now I'll stop sharing my screen for the question and answer session. Actually, I may have one question and one brief comment, but first I will look at the chat box to see what we have. By the way, if I miss any comments or questions, please just, I don't know, unmute yourself and tell me. So now we have a question, and I'm reading it. In the Turkish narrative, the Turkish victory, Greek defeat, is sometimes partially attributed to the Greek side's overconfidence in being able to overcome the Turkish positions and thus failure to prepare adequately. Do you believe in this claim of overconfidence, or do you believe that the Turkish victory was simply a case of Turkish side having superior tactics and fighting determination?
Absolutely. When they go ashore in Anatolia, when they first come in 1919 and go ashore and then expand their bridgehead in Asia Minor, they're very confident. Everybody, the Greeks, the British, the French, everybody underestimates the nationalists. Nobody takes them seriously. They're simply a bunch of renegade rebels up in the hills, and they don't understand the power of the potential power that Mustafa Kemal can, in his organizational skills, can bring to bear on the nationalist army, increasing its capability and its capacity. So after Sakarya, that's the point at which the Greeks are hit in the head so hard by the nationalists that they lose their confidence, and they are very aware in the fall of 1921 what a dangerous position they are in. So absolutely, that I would agree with that 100%.
Thank you. And we have another question from Ataberk Şenol. And Ataberk Şenol actually has two questions. I will ask the first one. I will read the first one. Can you explain the war crimes committed during the Turkish War of Independence in more detail, please? Well, I mean, I think we don't have too much time for a, like detailed presentation, but I mean, can you please just tell us about your ideas or views about possible events that can be labeled as war crimes or things like that?
Yeah, in these kinds of wars, irregular war, civil war, rebellions, those are the kind of wars where we see most war crimes committed. And in fact, that is a signature of those types of operations. So there are war crimes committed by all the participants. The Greco-Turkish War in the West, there's a lot of abuses and atrocities committed by both sides. It's a signature of armies that are losing. So when an army starts to lose, often that's as the Greek army withdraws from Afyon toward Izmir, they burn villages, they slaughter people. When Nurettin Sakala's central army puts down the Pontos rebellion, they also commit atrocities. So unfortunately, it's a part of war in the 20th century, and the Turkish War of Independence is no exception. All sides commit them.
Thank you. And another question from Dr. Haldun Solmaz Türk. It was indeed a team who won the war, but what distinguished Kemal Pasha as a general from other very good Turkish generals?
He in his capacity as the head of state, he is like Napoleon. He is the head of state and really the commander in chief. So what distinguishes him in this war is he's operating not simply as a military commander. He's also operating as a head of state. So we see a unique convergence of ability in how he manages to do this. There are a number of excellent Turkish and former Ottoman generals who might have been able to do this, but I'm not sure. If you take Kemal out, I'm not sure anybody is capable of stepping forward into that position as head of state and commander-in-chief and being successful.
So you mean that without Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, if he was not there, Turkish side could not have won this war? This is what you are saying, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure. He had prepared himself, in a way that, as I understand it, many of his contemporaries, he read continuously. He prepared himself by studying war. Not to say the others didn't, but he had fought as a he had fought as an insurgent in Libya. He had done counterinsurgency in Macedonia and in Syria. He had fought in conventional operations at Gallipoli and in Palestine, in the deserts, and up in the Caucasus in World War I. So what was unique about him as a military commander is he, I won't say he'd seen it all, but his experiences, his skill set was so broad. It was so broad compared to the others. I just have a hard time imagining somebody else doing that. But
yeah,
again, this is an interpretation. It's my opinion. Yeah.
Of course. And so now I want to ask you a question. I mean, it may be a little bit, I don't know, childish question. So please just excuse me, but who might be the second man? I mean, the first man, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and who is the second?
Yeah, in my judgment, the man I see who is most engaged in the nationalist cause as policy and as politics is Kazım Karabakar. He was a competitor for Kemal, and I think if things had been a little different, who else was in a position? Who else had at least a comparable skill set and an ability to balance the military and the political domains? I think it would be Kazım Karabakar would be the one I would suggest.
Yeah. So we have two more questions from I try to see the name Ataberk Şenol, if I'm not wrong. Yes, Ataberk Şenol. He has two questions. Actually, you answered maybe at least partially to these questions, but I still want to read them. Do you think that the Greek army had any chance of winning the Battle of Sakarya and capture the nationalist movement's headquarters in Ankara? This is the first question. And the second question of Ataberk Bey is that, actually you answered this more or less, but Turkish generals were quite experienced in means of warfare and strategies, whereas most of the Greek generals hadn't even commanded a battle before the Turkish War of Independence. Do you think this also had an effect on why the Turkish armies had the upper hand?
Yeah, for the first question, the Greek army and the nationalist army at the beginning of the Sakarya campaign were not together. The Greeks had to execute what we call a movement to contact. So it took them a week or more to move the army into a position along the Sakarya River by the Beylik Bridge and down along the Gok River. And at the end of that movement to contact, they were tired and they had to bring up their supplies, which were being carried at divisional level and below, mostly by horses and horse wagons. So they had to rest. They had to take a tactical pause. That enabled İsmet İnönü to reposition his forces and to create an almost unbreakable line in the mountains. So I think because of the initial position of the Greek army, winning the Battle of Sakarya was never possible unless İsmet İnönü had not reacted. But his reaction dooms the Greeks. Now, on the second question, there are a number of pretty good Greek generals, and I saw my friend Konstantinos do this just a minute ago. There are a number of pretty good generals who have some experience in the Balkan Wars and on the Macedonian front in World War I, and even on the Black Sea interventions that they engage in. But it's a heavily politicized environment. Mustafa Kemal was able to pick top commanders based on their ability as commanders. The Greeks are saddled and punished by politics. Which party is in power, and do the commanders that we're going to put in positions of leadership, are they reliable politically? So the Greeks have a number of commanders who kind of float in and out of this, who are men of ability, but are not politically favorable at the time. And that is, and this is again an opinion, that is their primary problem with selecting a slate of top-notch commanders.
Well, actually, in the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned Dr. Konstantinos Travlos' book, Salvation and Catastrophe, the Greek-Turkish War, 1919-1923. And Professor Travlos is actually with us. I mean, I can give the floor to him if he wants to add something.
Please do. Yeah, please do. I'd be curious.
Make any comment, Dr. Travlos? No, we don't hear you. We don't hear you. All right.
Now you can hear me. Thank you so much. And thank you for throwing a ball into my stadium. Again, I want to congratulate you on getting the book out. It's a very handsome volume. Right now, it's the best book in English about the events. I mean, generally speaking, your presentation is accurate. And I think I can tell you that probably Kazım Karabekir wouldn't be able to pull it off. And I'll tell you why. I think what makes Mustafa Kemal Atatürk very special as the commander-in-chief, political military commander-in-chief, supreme commander of the Turkish national movement, is his ability to understand the diplomatic game that was going on. And from what I've read, at least, from Karabekir, he's not as flexible. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk understood he had to play the Soviets against the Entente. That was the only way that the nationalist movement could survive politically. There's no other. He had to initially present himself as a friend of the Soviets to get their support, but avoid being devoured by them. And Karabekir, for example, was one of the officers that was very unhappy with the amount of close cooperations with the Soviets. He always distrusted them because he was much more religious than Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And then he had to be able to know when to essentially ditch the Soviets to play with the Entente. And I don't think anybody in the Turkish side, on the Turkish nationalist side, showed that kind of a capability. I think that, rather than, I mean, everything else is important, but I think that's the one unique capability that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk brought to the nationalist movement. It was his diplomatic acumen. I think if he was out of the picture, for example, if the Turkish army was encircled and destroyed at Kütahya, Eskişehir, Afyonkarahisar in July 1921, and there was a political crisis, I think it would have been very hard for any successors to pull it off. Second comment, I am going to disagree with you on Papoulas. Papoulas was a person who never had been given any high command in the Greek army because simply he was an alaya officer It's a Turkish term, you know it from your Balkan Wars book. He literally rose from the ranks. He never had any schooling, never went to any officer school, never went to a war school, never went to a staff school. So totally a soldier, which made him very popular and useful for maintaining a balance between the political competitions in the Greek army. Because something that people don't understand is when Gounaris and the Constantinos took power, they did a purge of Venizelist officers, but it was a very small purge. Only 500 officers were actually removed from command or from the army. The majority of regimental commanders and a lot of the divisional commanders were people who were serving during the Venizelos era. For example, at 2nd Inonu, of the 3 division commanders of Army Corps C, 2, Trikoupis, Leonardopoulos, were Venizelos. So Papoulas was chosen for 2 reasons. He was a very good friend of Gounaris, if you want to say the military confidant. And secondly, he was easygoing. But, you know, even Papoulas' defenders noted that he was not educated, trained, or had the experience to command a field army. And that's why they gave him Palis and Sarianis. Hadjianestis had more training. Hadjianestis' problem was he had left the army for 5 years, and many officers refused to serve under a commander that had been out of the army politically on his own choice voluntarily for 5 years. And that meant that very good officers like Polymenekos, 5th Division Commander Trilivas, they all left. The final point I want to make is about the Greek army's chances. I think in military history, you can never, ever, you should never make what-ifs that are about a political outcome of a military action. Because politics is complex. I'm a political scientist, too complex. Now, if you're asking, was it possible for the Greek army to win a military victory that will have potential strategic consequences for the war? I would say yes. And the key period is between November 1920. There are 2 key periods where this could happen. A, if Venizelos won the election, they already were preparing for a major operation, and that would have started not in June 1921, but in February 1921. That would have gained the Greeks time. Secondly, when Constantinos took power and Gounaris took power, the new army chief of staff, Gouvelis, you have him in the book, but unfortunately when we were writing the book, I couldn't give you some of the information I have now. Gouvelis suggests to Gounaris an immediate mass mobilization and massive operations for a huge offensive to start in April 1921. So in 2nd Inonu, instead of having 40,000 men attack, the Greeks will have attacked with 200,000 men. Gounaris refused it because he thought it would be politically wrong to do a mass mobilization so early after the election. So we go back to the politics then. Yeah. I think that was the only chance. That was the missed chance. Gounaris had the chance to win a major battle. I don't know if he could have won the war. That's a big question. I don't want to go into that. But a Greek army attacking with 200,000 men, I think, in April 1921 probably would not be resisted realistically by the Turkish army at that time. Inonu would have to save the army. He would have to retreat to Ankara, and he probably would have to give up Ankara and retreat to Sevastopol, to Sivas. So those are the 3 comments. Beyond that, the book, I think, is groundbreaking, and I know it will create more people writing books. I'm already working with Dorou Kakios on a book on the 1st and 2nd Inonu battles in English. I'm sure it will lead many Turkish academics to get back into writing more about this and new studies, especially operational military histories that are missing. That's all I'm going to say. Get this book, read this book, translate this book. Right now, it's the best that's available. It will be topped by a person who can read Ottoman Turkish, Greek, and has full access to the military archives of both countries, which might be something in 100 years. Thank you so much for giving me some of the time.
Thank you, Dr. Charles, and we hope to have you for another webinar, maybe, after September. So, yeah, I will be in touch with you about that. So, Actually, I don't see any more comments or questions. And I suppose, yeah. So, Edward, Professor Erickson, would you like to add anything? Or if not, I would like to give the floor to AVİM's director, Ambassador Alev Kılıç.
Yeah, let me just, one of the points Konstantinos made was going to full mobilization. For any country at war, the decision to go to full mobilization is a critical decision, because that then detracts or impedes from the economy. When you pull young men from jobs in the economy and make them soldiers, then the economy is in trouble. So the Hitler has a huge problem with this in 1940 of what to do. It affects the Greeks throughout the entire campaign. It's my own country in the American Civil War. At what point do we start to draft or conscript men? It's a political decision, and it rests on a balancing of the domestic economy and its strength, and the political strength of the leader who has to order it, because it's never popular in a country. So that is a big part of this, and I appreciate his comments. I hope you invite Konstantinos to give a webinar, because he has so much to say about this war that I frankly don't know, and I would love to hear. So if you invite him for a webinar, I'm going to be the first one to sign up. So this has been a pleasure. I have a tremendous admiration, as you know, for the Turkish military forces. I have a tremendous admiration for the Ottomans and their military, and for the last 100 years, the world has underestimated the Turks, and we see that today with the Turkish successes in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Libya. You know, this is a bad habit by the world, and that's to underestimate the Turks. And this is a part of that story. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about the book. The first two are in Turkish. I don't know if this book will be translated anytime soon into Turkish. I hope it will be. Again, I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Erickson. So I want to give the floor to AVİM Director, Ambassador Alev Kılıç. Mr. Kılıç, floor is yours.
Thank you, Turgut. Professor Erickson, it has been a great pleasure and privilege for us to have you with us again at Eurasian Studies Center seminar, webinar, conference, whatever you call it. We highly appreciate your interest and kind words on the history of Turkey, and your books, your trilogy, starting with the Balkan Wars, 1912-1913, then going on to Gallipoli, and then the Turkish War of Independence, really complete a very sensitive period in our history, in our recent history. And to hear this from a historian who is also a practitioner with military and combat experience, a rare combination of practice and academic scholarship, makes it even much more valuable and enchanting. Listening to you today, we have witnessed that there is another dimension of history, of general history, which is the military history, and we understand much more clearly with your presentation how it distinguishes from general history, and much more, I would say, down to earth and interesting. So we thank you for your meticulous research and the excellent moving presentation. We in Turkey are particularly proud of our recent history, of the rebirth of the Republic, and to hear it from you makes us even much more, I would say, self-confident. Thank you very much for being with us here again today, and we are looking forward to having you on another occasion, again on military history, recent history. I hope not far away, possibly within a few months' time. And until then, we wish you healthy days in this period, and all our best wishes for you. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Ambassador. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again, Professor Erickson, and thank you very much to all our audience. So now we are closing our webinar now, and we hope to meet with you again in our future events, webinars. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So I'm now ending it.